And I just want to welcome you to our part 4 of our invasive species webinar series. Today we will be covering invasive plants in natural areas. And I am Dr. Catherine Clements, and I am being joined by Wilma Holly today. So I am the Ecology and Natural Resources educator at University of Florida IFAS Extension. And I am also a lead Florida Master Naturalist instructor, and I provide a lot of education about wildlife, native and invasive plants, and also certainly invasive species and Florida's ecosystems. I grew up in Western New York, and I spent much of my time as a young child and teenager out in nature. And I actually started my professional career in environmental education and then transitioned after a few years of doing that into medical school and practiced as a physician for about 12 years. And then about 5 years ago, I decided I wanted to go back to environmental education. And that's when I started here with UF IFAS Extension in Sarasota County. I live with my park ranger husband in Oscar Scheer State Park for just another week or so, and then we will be moving into town as he has transitioned to working for Sarasota County as well. But it's been great to live in a state park for so many years and bring up our children, and we've had lots of animals, both domestic and wild, that have visited us over the years. And I'm very passionate about making a difference in our world through educating about our natural environment. So I'm going to turn it over to Wilma to introduce herself.
Hey, I also grew up in New York, but in the eastern part of New York. I've been teaching Florida-friendly landscaping for over 15 years. I started in Pinellas County there for several years before I moved down here to Sarasota County. And been here teaching. I had an environmental education program for elementary school before that, and did a lot outside. Grew up on a dairy farm, so that's how I guess I spent a lot of time outside when I was there, so kept going. So Extension is a partnership between Sarasota County, the University of Florida, and the USDA. And the university does the research, and we use their research and disseminate it for local needs, because different areas of the state are different. So all 67 counties in Florida have an extension office, and each one addresses their own local area. Through community initiatives, classes like this, other kinds of outreach and volunteer opportunities. And then we provide practical education to everybody to help them make better decisions. And our extension office here in Sarasota County is a rather large one compared to some of them. We have like 24 different people working out of our office. Some of them some of the extension offices only have 5 or 6 people. Catherine's the Ecology and Natural Resources, and I do the Florida Friendly Landscaping program, but we have all these other programs as well. My program is kind of under residential horticulture. We have a couple of programs here in this county that aren't in any other counties, one of them being chemical environment, which is more keeping chemicals out of the environment, teaching people the right way to using integrated pest management, and then all these others as well. And these are just some of the programs out of this office. School Gardens, Master Naturalist, which is one of the programs that Catherine does, and Florida Friendly Landscaping, Sustainable Communities, Florida Waters. We have a big Florida Water Stewardship program. My internet connection is unstable, so we'll see what happens here. Energy programs, Lake Watch, Family Nutrition Program, Florida Microplastic. 4-H is a big part of our office here, and then of course the Sea Grant and Green Business, all of those. There's a lot of them that we work on. So we're gonna, this is kind of what we're going through today, some definitions, some impacts, And then Catherine's going to do the natural area plants, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do to help. Last year, actually, of Extension came out with invasive species terminology to try to get everybody on board using the same terms, because there were so many different terms that were being floated around, and sometimes they were misunderstood and all. So we're trying to get everybody to use these terms. So a native is a species that occurs naturally in a geographic area, and for Florida before European settlers came. Non-native is a species that doesn't occur naturally in an area, and then introduced are species that were brought to the geographic area either intentionally or unintentionally by humans, and usually that was through travel, but you know, sometimes in other ways. Established species are species that are self-sustaining and reproducing population in that specified area, need human intervention to become established, and it applies to both native and non-native species. And then invasive, which is what we're talking about here today, are species that are, number one, non-native to a specified area. It was introduced by humans either intentionally or unintentionally, and then C, does or can cause environmental, economic, or harm to humans. So that's really important. They don't just put something on the list because they want to. There's some reason, and it's usually some kind of economic or environmental harm. Nuisance plant is used a lot, and it's an individual or group of individuals of a species that cause issues, especially in some of the natural native the parks. And they can cause property damage, they present threats to public safety, or they're just a annoyance, and that can be both native and non-native species. And one that brings to mind is the grapevine and Virginia creeper. Sarasota County actually has a ordinance or something like that to have those removed from the parks because they are such a nuisance, even though they are native species. Range change, sometimes due to climate change or circumstances, species shifts over time, and that can happen to native and non-native species with or without human assistance. And a couple of the things that that brings to mind is the coyote and armadillo. The coyote originally was kept out of Florida by the wolves, the red wolf, and then when they were driven to out of Florida, the coyotes started coming in more, and the same with the armadillo. And in Texas, the Muscovy duck has spread into Texas from South America just by changing the range of its habitat. So a few definitions here. This is from the USDA. A non-native plant that does not need human help to reproduce and maintain itself over time in an area where it is not native. Even though their offspring reproduce and spread naturally without human help, a naturalized plant do not over time become native. I think that's really important because I'll have people say, well, this is native, it's been here forever. And no, it's not. It's naturalized, but it is not native. So they don't become members of the local plant community. And again, what makes something invasive, these three things. Non-native to a specified geographic area, was introduced by humans either intentionally or unintentionally, and it does or can cause environmental or economic harm or harm to humans. And these are some other terms that are sometimes used, sometimes abused, and it's so easy to use these terms. Every now and then I'll find myself using one. I'm like, wait a minute, I can't use that. Alien, foreign, introduced, non-indigenous, and exotic are all terms that we sometimes use interchangeably. Sometimes these have bad connotations. They kind of mean the same thing, but it's so easy to misinterpret them because they mean different things in different situations. So not all non-native plants or animals are invasive, and that's something important to remember. And we have a slide on that explains that a little more. And this definition of a noxious weed, this is actually a legal term. Any plant or plant product that can directly or indirectly injure or cause damage to crops, livestock, poultry, or other interests of agriculture, irrigation, navigation, the natural resources of the United States, the public health, or the environment. So that's huge. And that is a legal term from the Agricultural Risk Protection Act. It's public law. So one of the problems with invasive species, they spread extremely rapidly, fast growth. They have rapid reproductive cycles, lots of generations, high fecundity. I can't say that word. Lots of offspring, behavioral plasticity, tolerance to a wide range of conditions, and they may be a generalist or an opportunist, which actually means that they can handle flooding, they can handle hot, they can handle cold, they can handle all those different things. So that's why they can grow in so many different areas and why they can take over an area. And they also lack their native predators and diseases that might have kept them under control in their natural area. And the dangers are they outcompete native species, and that's one huge problem right there. They push threatened species to extinction. They increase wildfire risk because some of them are very, very high fuel. They're like ladders, and they'll bring a fire right up a tree or something. Some of the vines, Malaluka and Colgan grass are a couple of those. Tall non-natives are unstable in tropical events like the Australian pine, and they're very, very difficult and expensive to control. And this one, I like this one. This is from the National Park Service, and it's a good way of explaining some of these conditions. Some exotics are capable of hybridizing with native plant relatives, resulting in unnatural changes to a plant's genetic makeup. Still others contain toxins that may be lethal to certain animals. Exotic organisms have been referred to as biological pollutions. In some cases, exotic plant invaders are driving our rare species closer to extinction. And one of the native plants that's a problem with right there, the biological pollution, is lantana. We have a couple of native lantana species, and there's so much crossing going on that they're afraid that we may lose the native plant altogether. And then once they're introduced, they're always introduced. European settlers brought hundreds of plants to North America and continue today and are increasing due to an exploding human population. Many introduced plants have become naturalized across the continent, and some are replacing North American native plant species. And that's from the National Park Service as well. And then there's a lot of huge impacts, and we're going to go over some of those. Here's another one from the National Park Service. Invasive non-native organisms are one of the greatest threats to the natural ecosystems of the U.S. and are destroying America's natural history. These unwelcome plants, insects, and other organisms are disrupting the ecology of natural ecosystems, displacing native plant and animal species and degrading our nation's unique and diverse biological resources. I really like that statement. That kind of puts it all in a nutshell. And so why do we prioritize native plants? Because they provide habitat, they're a preferred food source for a lot of native organisms. They provide soil health and stability, and there's ecosystem services with them and cultural values. And I'm Florida friendly, I don't say just native plants, but the more and more I work with native plants, I realize how valuable they are, because organisms have evolved through time with native plants, and that is so important to our cultural values and our ecosystem services. So the problem, everyone is moving here. There's 4,900 identified plant species in Florida, and 1,500 of those are non-native plant species. That's 31%, but invasive plants represent only 4% of that total number of plant species, but they comprise 33% of the total plant biomass growing in Florida. That's huge. Reports have also estimated that over 90% of Florida's public waters contain invasive plants. And later on, we told you this is an 8-part series, and we will have an invasive aquatic plants. Not today, but in one of the other episodes. Non-native plants love Florida. They're tropical, and we have climate that everybody loves. There's vast agricultural holdings, out-of-state landowners, and they don't always realize that there's problems, or either not aware or don't care sometimes. Seasonal populations, and they don't always understand invasive species threat. There's a greater urban wildland interface because we have such a buildup of urban areas against the wild and actually moving into wildland areas. So a lot of invasive species spreading to those areas. So we have an easy access. There aren't really borders except for north, but 85% of the non-native plants in the U.S. come through the port of Miami, which is a lot. 25,000 new plant introduced every year, either purposely or inadvertently. We have some of the largest ports in the country. There's a huge aquarium, landscape, nursery, and florist trade. They come in the ballast water of ships. They're transported by machinery, cars, or boats. And travelers bring back either souvenir plants, they bring back seeds, they might have insects on them. They could be diseased. There's a lot of things that are introduced in that way as well. 10 years ago, the cost of fighting invasive plants was, from Florida alone and over the whole country, it's millions more, but 23 million in Florida. That's the last data we have on that. The annual cost to the United States economy is estimated at 120 billion a year. Over 100 million acres, which is roughly the size of California, are suffering from invasive plant infestations, which is a lot. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's more than that, actually. Invasive species contributed directly to the decline of 42% of the threatened and endangered species in the United States. And there's several native, especially in Hawaii, the broadbill went extinct when the brown tree snake was introduced, and the Hawaiian thrush is extinct partially due to an invasive predator. So that 42%, and there's other ones that are being threatened, even native plants in Florida because of habitat destruction. So there's a lot there. This invasion curve, and this kind of explains the whole process of trying to get rid of plants. If you can prevent a plant down there at the lower left, if you can prevent a plant from coming in, then you've got it made. But as we've told you, they're coming in from all different directions, and especially in Florida with the ports and the nursery trade and all, the aquarium trade, all that stuff going on. So we can't always prevent it. So then the next step is eradication. If something got here and we can eradicate it, then it's going to save cost and all that. And one example of that is the African land snail, and I'm sure there's some plants that they've managed to eradicate too. But down in the South Florida on the east coast, sorry. They had a huge problem with it in a couple of counties, and they put out traps and did a whole bunch of intense work there, and did manage to get rid of that. So then if you can't eradicate it, then comes the containment stage. And there's, rapid increase in distribution, abundance of many populations, and then they're trying to contain them so they don't get any worse. And then beyond that, they're just trying to protect their assets, trying to control what's there, save save the native species, things like that. So that's huge. Catherine, did you want to add anything on that?
I'll just mention that also part of what this curve references is just the cost of trying to manage these invasive species. So it's much more cost effective, obviously, just like with our health, it's much more cost effective to prevent a situation than it is to get all the way up here where we are now being overrun by specific species that we're just trying to protect our wildlands and our native plants. So it's also economically important to try to prevent or eradicate and not get into the situations of containment and asset-based protection.
So, and then we always talk about invasive plants, and some people say, well, who decides that? So we're going to go over that with you. The legal and regulatory department that controls it is the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, often called FDACS. And then the Florida Wildlife and Conservation Commission, they're legal and they can regulate plants and animals. And then we talk a lot about IFAS assessment of non-native plants in Florida's natural areas, and the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants, and then the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council. Those three are just advice and information. They're not regulatory, but they have lists that we go by. The U.S. IFAS assessment of non-native plants, there's a link there, and we will send out to everybody that's registered, we'll send links to these things. It's research-based. It separates lists based on the area of the state, so north, central, and south. So it may be invasive in the south, but freezes out in the north, so it's not invasive there. And it might just be on the caution in the central because they haven't found it in natural areas. So that's a good way to separate them out. Any plant on the state or federal noxious weed list, and remember the noxious weeds is a legal term, and those are prohibited. They're included, prohibited in the assessment. And then also besides prohibited, it also has an invasive no uses, high invasion risk, low invasion risk, caution, and not a problem species. So there's a lot of different categories in there trying to help people determine what is okay to plant and what they shouldn't plant. And they're continually evaluating more plants. As we told you earlier, a whole bunch of new plants are coming in every year. So they have not gotten through all 4,900 species. They're still working on as hard as they can, but it sometimes takes a year or two to evaluate to find out if they are spreading and all. So it takes a while to be added. So these are the 3 zones in Florida, roughly correspond to the USD cold hardiness zone. That's okay, go ahead. And this traffic light is a good way to kind of visualize what these different species mean. Prohibited, invasive no uses would be red, stop, stay away, don't plant it, get rid of it. If it's in your yard, take it out. Caution, the yellow light, kind of, okay, slow down, be careful. They'll reevaluate it in a couple of years, but there's a moderate risk that it may become invasive. And then the green light is not a problem species. It may be documented, but not a problem, and or undocumented, and they will reassess in 10 years. And that is 60% of the non-native plants. So as you can see, that's most of them. But as we told you before, the biomass is way, way higher because there's so many, because they grow so fast. And you can use the extension office to get information on ID. We can help you with ID. There's a lot of ways to get that information. And this is an example of a couple pages on the assessment. When you go to the link, it brings you to the home page, which then you can type a plant in there. It used to be very specific. If you spelled it wrong or anything else, you couldn't find it. But now you can just start typing a word in, either the Latin or the common name, and it'll bring up a list of what you might be looking for. So that's handy now. It's still a little bit of tricky to first get used to it, but it's not bad. And then if you go to the assessment page, these are all the plants that come up, all the plants that they've already assessed. Now, all these are not invasive. There's just a couple right there in front that the first time I saw this page, I said, that's not invasive. And then I realized this is just the plants that they've done, and some are invasive. But a quick way to review what the plant is, and then you click on that plant and it takes you to the assessment page and how they assessed it and what it's assessed as. This is one example. This happens to be the dwarf Tradescanthus bathacea. It used to be called Rio. And that's not a problem species in Central or North Florida, but it's invasive in South Florida. I guess that's not the dwarf, that's the regular, because the dwarf one is not. So Central and North Florida, you can use it. South Florida, you can't use it. So that's an example of what you would see, kind of a little bit different order, but and then where to find Florida information. We told you about the Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants and Invasive Plant Laws. You can find there at that link. And like I said, we're sending these links to you. Florida State listed noxious weeds. They have a list on that. And then the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council, that link there. And this is an example of the Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council. And they list just by Latin name first, and then the common name in the second column, and then they tell you the zone of the state that which is good because they do have the zone too. And then they have a category 1, which is the worst and the prohibited and ones like that, and then a category 2, which are invasive exotics that have increased in abundance or frequency, but have not yet altered plant communities. So, and category 1 has altered plant species. So they may become category 1 if ecological damage is exhibited later on or documented later on, but for now they're still in category 2. And my recommendation is not to plant anything that's in either one of those categories if possible, because you don't want to have something that may become invasive. If it's already on the watch list, that means there's a good probability. So, and I think those in conjunction using FLEPC and the UF Florida IFAS assessment, using both of those kind of reviewing plants, and if they're on both lists, then you know they're not good. Okay, now Catherine is going to go into some of the plants for you.
All right, so we're going to cover a whole bunch of plants that are threatening our natural areas. If you've been on some of our other invasive species webinars, there are just a couple that are repeated that Wilma talked about earlier in some of the earlier webinars, because they threaten both our landscapes and our yards as well as our natural areas. But there aren't too many duplicates in here. So most of these are going to be new compared to some of the other ones that Wilma's talked about in the last 2 parts. So we're going to talk about trees and shrubs first. So this is a picture of Carrotwood. And I was driving the other day and stopped at a red light and noticed a whole bunch of Carrotwood on the side of the street. And with it are some of the other plants we're going to talk about, like Brazilian pepper was right next to it as well. But this is Carrotwood. You can see the prolific fruit or berries that it creates with the 3 seeds in each of those pods. It is assessed by UF IFAS as prohibited, so it actually is regulated both in the state as well as federally, and therefore it also falls on the FLEPC Category 1 list. So this is one of our worst offenders. It originated in Australia. It is a fast-growing evergreen, and it is beautiful, which is why people originally loved it and planted it in their landscapes. And of course, many homes still have this plant in their landscapes, and we also find it encroaching into our natural areas. But it's no longer legal to sell it or plant it in our state. It can grow up to 35 feet tall. It's very shade tolerant, but these fruits are very messy when they fall from the plant. The seed capsules contain the 3 red seeds that you see here on your screen. And cedar waxwings, which is a type of bird, really do like to eat these berries. So it is feeding the wildlife to some extent, but usually our invasive plants do not provide as much wildlife habitat or food for wildlife as our native plants would. Here's a picture of it further away. You can see it's got lovely foliage, but very prolific in terms of its seeds. It is a common landscape plant, but it is an ecological threat not only to landscapes, but also to dunes, coastal strands, sand pine scrub, slash pine flatwoods, cypress swamps, freshwater marshes, and riverbanks. So this is one of those plants that can have a lot of environmental or habitat generalism. It can live in a lot of different places. It's also a special threat to mangroves and tropical hammocks. And we have lost a huge amount of our mangrove forests, both in our county as well as throughout our state. And so anything that is threatening our mangrove forest at this point really is a special ecological concern. It also alters the understory habitat, so it alters the plants that grow underneath what would be in our native ecosystems. So this is a picture that Wilma took. In fact, many of these beautiful pictures are Wilma's pictures, but these are 1,000 Carrotwood seedlings that Wilma pulled from a 4 foot by 18-inch area. So once again, very prolific. If all those seeds drop on the ground, they're going to germinate into so many seedlings that then could become adult plants. So this is a great way to get rid of them early, is to hand pull them. But Wilma, how long did it take you to hand pull all those seedlings?
Not very long, because I could just grab them. The hardest part was counting them.
Right, which is why you want to do it early, because once that grows into a much larger tree, obviously it's going to be much harder to manage. So here's a close-up of the leaves. They have very distinctive leaves with this quite obvious yellow midrib or midvein here. The leaves are alternate and compound, so this is actually an entire leaf with these individual leaflets. And we see on this example that this leaf has an odd number of leaflets, but occasionally can also be even. So you want to pull the seedlings, you can cut the trees, but if you cut the trees, you generally have to treat the stump as well. So Brazilian pepper tree, also found in very many different areas. It is also a habitat generalist. It also is threatening not only our mangrove forest, but also our upland ecosystems. This is probably one of our biggest offenders in our state. So it is a prohibited plant. It is also listed on our category 1 on the FLEPC list. And it is native to Brazil, hence its name, and Paraguay. It was introduced in the 19th century and was found in Central and South Florida. At that point, we are starting, as the climate continues to change, we will probably continue to see this plant start to creep into northern Florida. But it is one of our most widespread of Florida's non-native invasive plants. It's estimated to cover over 700,000 acres of our state. It loves disturbed sites, so areas that have been disturbed by mowing or tilling the soil, or because of development or agriculture, it will love to start up in those soils. It also loves fire excluded sites. So our ecosystems here in Florida, for the most part, are fire dependent and need fire in order to be healthy. So as we suppress or exclude fire, because we are concerned about our residential and commercial developments that are closer to these natural areas, then Brazilian pepper is more likely to take a foothold in those natural areas. So it's formed dense forests adjacent to mangrove communities, and it really provides a limited habitat compared to native species like mangroves. So yes, some birds do eat the berries that you see here. Robins will eat the berries, but the berries, as they get older, actually ferment, and the robins that eat them will actually become a little drunk from those fermented berries. So a lot of other wildlife do not like the berries. It also, Brazilian pepper tree will not provide the soil stabilization that mangroves do in our coastal environments. So once again, this is an invasive that in our area does not provide to our wildlife or to our ecosystems the services that our native plants do. It's fine in its native area of Brazil and Paraguay. It's going to have co-evolved with the organisms there and provide habitat in its native regions, but not so much here in Florida. And you can see once again how prolific this plant is. Look at all those tiny little yellowish white flowers. There's like, you know, if we tried to count them, we would be here for a while. There's like a bazillion flowers just in this one picture, let alone on an entire plant, let alone on hundreds of plants. So once these flowers are pollinated and they fruit out, birds can pick them up and mammals can pick them up or eat them and then carry them and leave them in other areas. So that's one of the ways that the seeds disperse. And they actually have a narcotic, like the sort of birds getting drunk on the fermented berries, or a toxic effect. Seeds are viable for up to 2 months, and the acids in the GI tract of animals actually aid in the germination once those seeds sort of go through the digestive tract of the animal and travel to a new location. They are sold in some areas as pink peppercorns, and then this plant is also used in wreaths. It was originally brought here because of its aesthetic qualities, and it's also called Florida holly because of that bright green foliage and the bright red berries. It is related to poison ivy. It's in the same family as poison ivy and poison oak. So the sap of the Brazilian pepper may irritate your skin if you have a sensitivity to poison ivy. So please be careful if you are trying to hand remove this, especially if you know you have a sensitivity to poison ivy. It will cause an irritated rash. So we did release something called a BioControls. So BioControls are when we use biological or living things to try to control other plants or other living things. And so the Brazilian pepper tree thrip was released in 2019 and is currently being studied for its ability to try to control some of the growth of these Brazilian pepper trees. It is the thrip and the leaf galler are native insects to the area where the plant is native. And before these biocontrols are released in an area where those insects are not native, like here in Florida, the University of Florida researchers study those things for upwards of 10 to 20 years before they release them to make sure that they're safe and they're not going to cause problems to our native ecosystems, our native plants and animals, or our agricultural crops. So there's a lot of research that goes into something like that. And then when they do release them initially, they release them into small pilot plots where they are watching and collecting data to determine how these thrips are impacting the Brazilian pepper tree. Are they really working? And are they safe to continue to release into larger areas? But once again, look at this picture, so prolific. So one Brazilian pepper tree can make hundreds to thousands of new Brazilian pepper trees. And this is one of the adaptation strategies that plants utilize in order to become invasive. So let's move on to the Australian pine. This is another prohibited plant, both statewide and federally. So therefore it's also in the FLEPC category 1 list. It was or is native to Australia, the South Pacific Islands, and Southeast Asia. It was introduced to our state in the 1890s and is now found once again in South and Central Florida. And a lot of times you'll see this because South and Central Florida have more of a subtropical climate, whereas as you get into northern Florida, some of these plants are not going to survive as well. So the Australian pine is a misnomer because it's not actually a true pine. It's just named that because it looks like pines. It also likes disturbed habitats and is very fast growing. It is salt, drought, and heat tolerant. So that's that behavioral plasticity that Wilma talked about, where these plants also have these adaptations where they can tolerate so many different types of habitats. So this can invade our beach communities, which is where we see it a lot in Sarasota County. You'll see it on some of the islands like Siesta Key and near the beaches. It actually causes problems with erosion and interferes with sea turtle nests. It has a very shallow root system, so it doesn't stabilize soil like we thought it would. It's one of the reasons why it was initially planted, but it actually doesn't stabilize soil. And so it is dangerous during high wind events that we experience here in Florida. And injured trees compartmentalize their wounds poorly. So for a lot of trees, when they are wounded or have an injury, they actually sort of wall off that injury, almost like creating scar tissue around that injury so that it can't further damage the tree. But Australian pines do not do that well. So decay will advance rapidly through the trunk, making them more likely to become a dangerous problem during high wind events. So here is a picture of the pine-like needles. This is partly why they were named a pine, because they have these needle-like leaves that look a lot like pine needles, but they aren't actually the same. They also have these modified cone-like structures, and those cones have upwards of 70 seeds per cone. And this tree will make lots of these little cones. So just multiply 70 times, probably hundreds of cones that a single tree will make. It's also not a useful source of food for our native wildlife, and it threatens native plants and critical habitat. And another one, these are all some of the worst ones. Malaluka, also called paperbark or punk tree. This is Malaluka cancanervia. It is on the Flepsy category 1. It is native to Australia, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. It was introduced in the early 1900s as an ornamental plant because it has these beautiful bottle brush-like floral inflorescences. And it was intentionally spread throughout the Everglades to try to manage or change the hydrology of the Everglades. So it utilizes water quite rapidly and changes the hydrology. And this actually has become a problem with this unique ecosystem. It's also been planted as a landscape tree in Florida throughout until about the late 1970s. It can invade a variety of habitats. So once again, it can live in wet areas all the way into dry areas. So it has that habitat generalism. It has this very unique bark. So once you learn to recognize the bark, you can often recognize the tree from far away. It has sort of papery whitish bark. You can mulch this bark, and it has been considered safe when you buy the mulch from a store because it should have been treated with heat to prevent germination of any remnant seeds that might be found in that mulch. It has a low wind resistance as well, so also dangerous in our high wind events. And those blooms come out in spring and summer. They have a really strong odor. And this plant in general, this tree in general, has a lot of essential oils in it. It is related to the Malaluka tree in Australia that we make tea tree oil from. So it has a similar constituent in it. And that can be very irritating to people, both topically when it gets on your skin, but also causing an allergic reaction and watery eyes, itchy nose, that sort of stuff. So some people will have a reaction to this tree if it's in their yard and blooming. Although there are sometimes a few positives of some of these plants. For instance, Brazilian pepper tree and the Malaluka tree both are useful for honey production. but that's one of the small positives compared to many negatives with these plants. So here's another picture, just because this is such a great picture that shows the bark. There's not really anything else in our area of Florida that has this whitish, grayish, sort of papery bark. Up north, we have birch trees that may look similar to this, but we don't have those, at least in this part of Florida. So this really is pretty unique and easy to identify once you recognize the bark. So Rattlebox is a shrub, and it's in the pea family. So it has these pods, and it has very sort of distinctive flowers that, if you're familiar with peas or legumes, then you're going to recognize both the compound leaves, the pea-like flowers, and of course the pods of this plant, because it's in that family. This plant is considered invasive in South and Central Florida, but only a caution to plant in North Florida, and is found on the FLEPC Category 2 list. So once again, I would not plant this just because it still is considered invasive here and could become invasive up in the north. It's native to South America and was cultivated as early as 1927 in Florida because it's pretty, which is a lot of reason why some of these plants are here. Is they initially were brought here because they are unique and pretty, and we just didn't realize what a problem they were going to become. It can grow up to 10 feet tall as a woody shrub. It has what we call allelopathic effects in their seeds. So allelopathy is when there is some type of chemical in the plant that sort of harms or is toxic or sort of is irritating to other plants or animals. And so these seeds do have allelopathic effects, and that allows this plant to form dense monocultures. So monocultures are when this plant just grows and outcompetes or pushes everything else out of the way, or uses its allelopathy so that other things will not grow there. And then a monoculture is just all one plant, which of course limits our diversity when that happens. Wildlife don't like to eat it, and all parts of the plant are toxic. Seeds can remain viable for over 2 years, and germination is actually enhanced by changes in temperature and moisture, which of course we have here in Florida. So some of our climatological conditions actually improve germination of this plant. This is the aquatic soda apple, and I put this in here as an example of one of the ones that were sort of in the prevention stage on that evasion curve, at least for our county and Sarasota County, because this was just recently cited in Sarasota County just in the last year or so. This is actually a photograph from one of our local biologists, and he found this plant on one of our conservation lands in Sarasota County. And prior to that, it hadn't really been seen here, although it has been found in other counties in our state. It is a prohibited plant. It's on the Category 1 list. It's native to Mexico, West Indies, and Belize. And it was only first recorded in Florida in 1983. So it hasn't been here that long, but it's definitely impacting other counties in our state. And we definitely don't want it to continue to expand its range into other counties. It does occur in relatively undisturbed wetlands, so it is a threat to our natural freshwater wetlands. It does create monocultures, and its seeds are very tolerant of a number of conditions and are viable for at least a year. And the germination rate of the seeds for this plant are upwards of 90%, which is a really high germination rate. So here it is, sort of a picture of it forming a dense monoculture. So this is what we don't want to see. It also has a lot of spines along its midribs, as well as its stem. And we're going to see in a second a relative to this plant that grows in upland areas. But this is our freshwater tropical aquatic soda apple. So we're going to go into herbaceous plants. So although our aquatic soda apple can grow more as a shrub in wetland areas, This is our tropical soda apple, which is going to grow more as an herbaceous plant. It's mostly low growing in more of our upland areas. It is also a prohibited plant by IFAS assessment in Category 1 on FLEPC. It was first collected in Florida in 1988, so both of our soda apples have only been here for a few decades. This one invades our scrub, and scrub is another one of our endangered habitats, like our mangrove forest. We have lost a huge percentage of our scrub throughout our state, so we really need to protect some of these unique environments. It also invades mesic flatwoods, which are like our pine flatwoods, bottomland forests, which are forests along streams, and then some of our strand swamps, like our big cypress. It outcompetes native plants, and it is toxic to livestock. It's considered a noxious weed, so it's actually a big problem in our rangelands as well, because it is toxic if our livestock eat it. And look at it, it's very nasty too. You certainly want this in your mouth or in the mouth of an animal. Here's the little fruit on it. The fruit look very much like little tiny watermelons initially. They have this green and light green coloration. And then that dark veining turns quite yellow when ripe. There can be upwards of 400 seeds per each of these fruit. So once again, right here, we're just seeing a few fruit on a single plant, but each of those fruit have 400 seeds in them. So each plant can produce 40 to 50,000 seeds per year. That's amazing. And it has a germination rate anywhere of 30 all the way up to 100%. So if one plant is producing 50,000 seeds and all 50,000 of those seeds germinate, you can see why these plants are such a problem. These seeds are dispersed by birds, livestock, machinery, and even found in contaminated hay. So that's part of how they actually disperse far and wide. This is a picture of Wedelia. Wedelia is definitely forming a monoculture here. So everything in this picture other than the trees and a little bit of Spanish moss on the ground is actually this plant called Wedelia. So it is also called creeping oxeye. It is considered invasive with no uses, but unfortunately it is still sold in garden centers because it's beautiful. I'm going to show you a picture of the flower in just a second, and it is pretty. It's from Central and South America and Mexico. Here it is. Very pretty. It looks like a little sunflower or daisy. But as you can see, it is taking over the areas where it is found. And it can be found in, I often see it, for instance, near streams or areas where the soil remains damp for part of the year. It can be a serious weed in our crops and lawns, and it reproduces vegetatively by rooting at the nodes. And very little, if any, seeds are produced. So this is a plant that doesn't produce a lot of seeds or reproduce that way. It's really going to reproduce vegetatively through all of that rooting. So here's a picture of the flowers. It does look a little similar to some of our native flowers, like our state flower Coreopsis. So you might want to learn to tell the difference from them. But once you look at this a few times, you will learn the flower as well as the leaf and be able to recognize it. It forms those dense mats. You can control it by pulling and then properly disposing. So you don't want to just pull these and leave them sitting somewhere because they potentially will root where they are sitting and then just start to regrow. You also don't want to just send them in with the rest of your yard waste, because then they could start to grow where the yard waste is taken. So you really want to put them, for instance, in dark plastic garbage bags so that they go into the dump and go underground and don't have an opportunity to regrow. You may need to follow this one up with weed killer as well. Caesar's weed. This is Wilma's and my nemesis. I feel like we like to talk about this one, but oh, it is an issue. It is also a beautiful plant. Look at those beautiful little pink flowers. I can't tell you how many times I've gone on walks in some of our county preserves and people are like, oh my gosh, what's that beautiful plant? And yes, it is beautiful, but it just causes so many issues for our native ecosystems. So it does seed prolifically. You can see sort of back here some of the green fresh seed pods. I'm going to show you a better picture in a second, but those seed pods contain a variety of seeds, as well as they have like these little hooks on them, sort of like Velcro, that catch onto people and animals and allow the seeds to be dispersed far and wide. Caesar's weed can grow really short. I'll show you a picture of that in a second, but then it continues to grow and it can grow upwards of 10 feet tall, taller than myself or Wilma. It is an herbaceous perennial and the leaves vary in size and shape, but generally they are palmately lobed and they are pubescent or hairy. This is found in disturbed areas, so often like along roadsides, in areas where the soil has been tilled up and disturbed. Oops, sorry. And it has no known biological control. You can mulch in the areas where it's found to help control seed germination, but really mostly you're going to try to hand pull it. So here it is as a bazillion little tiny seedlings. So you can see when it first comes up, it's more round in its morphological feature, and then it starts to become more palmately lobed as it gets larger. As with anything, it's going to be a lot easier to hand pull these little tiny seedlings than deal with the large plant. And once the plant has seeded out, you also have to be careful if you're going to try to pull it, that you are not continuing to distribute the seed. And you will often have to pick that seed off of your clothes, your shoes, your equipment to make sure you're not carrying it further away. So here's a couple pictures of the larger plants. Here is all of those seed capsules, and you can see them in a variety of more of the fresh green capsules versus as they start to dry out or over winter, you're going to have these brown. Here it is along the edge of a more natural area. So you see grass, you see some native plants like that is Cabbage Palm there, and probably a live oak back here. But then you've got this wide expanse of Caesar weed, and behind that you actually have a Brazilian pepper tree.
There's Carrotwood back there too.
Ah, beautiful. And then Wilma, tell me what happened here.
That's the edge of my neighbor's backyard, the other one. And I go in and cut those out. This is just along the road, and it was in the winter time. And so they're dying down, but they'll come back up the next year if they're not cut out. But there was thousands and thousands of seeds on there.
Yeah, so prolific. And this is after Wilma pulled a whole bunch, and you can see, so here's a close-up of those seed capsules with the little Velcro-y hooks, and they just get on everything. Here's Wilma's gloves, here's Wilma's shoes. And that's an important thing to notice if you go hiking in a natural area. If you have seeds that attach to you, maybe you recognize them as Caesar weed, so you know they're invasive. Maybe you're not sure what the seeds are because we have some native plants that also will sort of stick to you as you hike around. But you may want to remove those before getting in your car and taking those seeds to another location. So just be aware of that, because that is one of the ways that these plants will disperse is by attaching to animals or us humans. All right, I'm going to talk about a couple ferns. This is Old World Climbing Fern, or Lygodium microphyllum. This is a huge problem down in the Everglades. It is prohibited, and it is a Category 1 on the FLEPC list. It is native to Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. Here in Florida, it was reported to have infested over 1,000 acres in Jonathan Dickinson State Park. And that state park's on our East Coast, and it actually has some of our remaining scrub habitat in it. So it's not an area that we want infested with this plant. As well as it infested the Loxahatchee River area. This had increased to 17,000 acres in a matter of 2 years. So that is an amazing rapid growth and infestation of this plant. And it really does grow incredibly rapidly. It is a vining fern, so it will crawl up over other plants and up into the tree canopy, which we're going to hear about in a second. We're going to watch a video and it's going to talk about why that is such a problem. It can invade upland and wetland habitats, and its spores can be viable for 4 years. And of course, once again, if you are trying to do any type of treatment or removal of this climbing fern, when it is actually fertile, you might be distributing the spores without realizing it. So be very careful about when you do try to remove these plants. So here's a picture of it from, this is one of the University of Florida invasive plant researchers. So this is all the old world climbing fern. And you can see not only is it all over the ground, it is climbing over some of the native plants like saw palmetto here, but also climbing up into the tree canopy. Here it is after an experimental treatment where they were trying to learn how best to control it. So everything in there, that's that reddish brown, that is the old world climbing fern. So it really was causing quite a problem in this area and is covering tree islands in the Everglades, for instance. All right, I have a couple of videos to show you guys so that you don't just have to listen to me. There you go.
Today we're cooperating with the U.S. Department of Agricultural Research Service to release some biocontrol insects on old world climbing fern, the invasive species that's growing in our conservation lands and causing a lot of ecological impacts. And it's spreading northward into central and north Florida at a rapid rate. Oh, that's really flammable. Old world climbing fern in swamps and wetlands allows these non-fire adapted communities to burn, damaging the habitats and preventing them from functioning as natural fire breaks. I'm Brian Nelson with the Southwest Florida Water Management District. I manage our vegetation management section.
So we have two separate agents that we've brought out here today. I'm James Murphy. I'm a biological science technician at the USDA ARS Invasive Plant Research Lab in Fort Lauderdale. We are looking at the larva of Neomucetema conspircitalis. We also call it Neo. This larva will feed for a period of 3 weeks to a month before it will pupate and emerge as a moth. The other is a microscopic mite. The scientific name for that is Phloracarus parepi. They'll basically feed inside those galls right there. The goal for releasing these two agents is to establish them in the field, and with the hope that they will continue to feed and control the growth and spread of Lygodium.
Today we're releasing some of the insects at the Pasco County water treatment plant in cooperation with Pasco County. Near this property here in Pasco is the Cypress Creek Preserve. And then we're also going to go to a private property in the Green Swamp, joining our Green Swamp property to release. Old world climbing fern forms dense canopies on understory and trees and blocks sunlight to the native plant communities, so it does destroy native plant communities. Biological control agents, once you release them and they become established, they will reproduce and spread to other areas where they haven't been released. It also potentially can help control the plant on private properties adjoining district lands. We're hopeful that releasing biocontrol agents to control old world climbing fern without herbicides will help reduce the cost and the effort required to manage this plant on district lands. So this is real good for us.
And not only is there old world climbing fern, but then there's also Japanese climbing fern. So it is related. You see the same genus name Lygodium, so they're very closely related. This one is mostly going to be central to North Florida, whereas our old world climbing fern is the one that's a problem in the Everglades and also moving into central and starting to move into North Florida. Once again, as we start seeing changes in our climate, these ranges of these plants can change. But the Japanese is going to be more central to North Florida. Also prohibited and on the Category 1 FLEPC list, native to Eastern Asia. This one was introduced to Florida in 1932 as an ornamental, so it's very pretty when it's in a little small container. But this is what happens when some of our ornamental plants or house plants are then released out into the wild. It can form tangled masses, which kills the underlying vegetation, just like we saw with its relative, the Old World climbing fern. So this one looks a little bit different. So it has more what I consider like frilly leaves, more deeply cut leaflets. And the fertile leaflets are contracted in shape, and they have 2 rows of sporangia on the underside of the leaflet. And then the margins of the leaflet sort of roll over to cover the sporangia. The light brown spores are nearly microscopic, and they can be spread by wind or carried on vehicles or spread when we try to cut it down and control it, just like with the Old World climbing fern. So this video is going to talk to you a little bit about the difference between the two and show you some great pictures of that.
Hello, I'm Pat Minogue with the University of Florida, and this is Japanese climbing fern, which is something of a super invasive, Lygodium japonicum. Even as I touch it, there are numerous spores that are coming out of the sporophytes, and it reproduces by spores. They're microscopic. Those spores can move in the air. They can go with water currents. They can be moved by animals and by people. So it has a way of getting around. Japanese climbing fern begins as a few scattered individuals. You'll see it in particular close to pine stems, if you're in a pine stand. It'll climb up those stems. It likes the bark. It's easy for Japanese climbing fern to go up the bark. To me, the big problem with Japanese climbing fern is that it grows over the top of some of our important understory vegetation, like this American beautyberry, which is important to wildlife as a food source. Very soon, this plant will be overtopped. It'll be literally drugged towards the ground. It'll be all covered up with this vine. It'll choke this plant out and it will die. You can see here this brownish colored rachis that is the main stem. The leafy branches off the main rachis or pinnae are compound and triangular in overall outline. They are 4 to 8 inches long. The leaflets or pinnules are lobed and stalked. The terminal lobes are often dissected. The basal lobes are irregularly lobed or dissected. The leaf blade tissue is pubescent below with short curved hairs. The fertile leaflets are contracted in shape with 2 rows of sporangia along the leaf margin, which is rolled to partially cover the sporangia. Numerous spores are produced from those sporangia, and most spore production occurs in the month of October. Another way that Japanese climbing fern can spread is by rhizomes below ground. These are usually dark in color, almost a black. Japanese climbing fern to me looks quite different than Old World climbing fern because of its feathery, light green fronds, which contrast to the leathery appearance of the Old World climbing fern, which has leaf margins which are more entire, whereas Japanese climbing fern is lobed. We're in a 20-year-old slash pine stand here north of Bluntstown in the coastal plain of Florida. Here, Lygodium japonicum, Japanese climbing fern, a super invasive plant. This area had been raked for pine straw just 4 years ago, and they fertilized to promote the development of additional needles. With good rainfall, this plant moved in and has now covered the ground in most of the area. It's climbing up these trees. It can climb easily to as much as 90 feet off the ground. I regard it as a super invasive weed. Japanese climbing fern is a significant threat to natural reproduction in pine and hardwood forests. It's begun an exponential rate of spread through North Florida. Please learn to recognize this plant and bring it under control right away.
So So I think those videos really drive home how much of an impact some of these plants are having, especially on our natural areas, and also how difficult they are to control. And then one of the things that I wanted to mention when we talk about how those vining ferns, for instance, can climb up into the canopy, that leads them to become ladder fuels. So if there is a fire in that area, so just think back, actually, let's go back to one of those pictures. So if we look at this picture here, if a fire were to occur in this area, this plant is going to easily be able to carry the fire up into the canopy. And canopy fires are much more dangerous both to the plants themselves, as well as to a wildfire or a controlled burn getting out of control. And so you generally don't want to have a canopy fire for a number of reasons. And generally, if rangers are doing prescribed fires, for instance, they manage the fire so that the fire does not get into the canopy and does not end up killing the larger trees. So this causes that problem as well, that it can lead to a canopy fire and further destruction. So here's just another picture that shows you the differences between the old world climbing fern compared to the Japanese climbing fern, but both of them are invasive problems. Then talk about one more fern, the tuberous sword fern. So this is a really common one, This is a really common one that I see in some of our Sarasota County preserves and also in a lot of people's yards. So it is considered invasive in Central Florida and cautions for use in South Florida, but it is on the Category 1 FLEPC list. It is native to the tropics, and it is still often sold as Boston fern in the nurseries and is often confused with our native Boston sword fern. And this is difficult because we do have a native fern that has the same common name and looks incredibly similar. So sometimes it's hard to know what you're actually buying, and sometimes things are even mislabeled in the nurseries. This one was found in Florida in 1933 on a roadside in Sumter County. And then in 1938, it was being cultivated in Floral City, Florida, and being used in the florist industry. It's now found in pine rocklands, flatwoods, marsh edges, and hammocks. The Asian sword fern is related to it, which is another invasive that's been found on Sanibel since 1954. So this is just a diagram of the invasive sword fern. And these are some of the ways to tell it apart from our native. So let's just look at this part in the middle of the screen, the invasive. So the invasive sword fern, the fronds taper towards the tip. So the leaflets get smaller towards the tip of the frond, and the leaflets get smaller towards the base of the frond. The base of the pinnae or leaflets overlap. So you'll see as you get up here, the bases of those leaflets will all actually lay on top of each other or overlap each other by a little bit, whereas the native one does not. The midrib divides those leaflets or pinnae unevenly in the invasive, whereas the native, the midrib will go right down the middle of those leaflets. There are hair-like scales on the rachis, which is basically what we would call maybe the stem of the fern, but we call it the rachis. So hair-like scales, and then the round tubers. So the round tubers are sort of a definitive identifying characteristic. If you think you have the invasive sword fern and you pull it up and you find tubers, then yes, you definitely have the invasive, because the native one does not make these tubers. But I will also say that the invasive one doesn't always have tubers on it. So the tubers won't always be there, but if they are there, you definitely have the invasive. And this one's going to form dense stands. Where I see this even in people's yards, often people plant it under their live oaks, and then it just starts to spread out and take over. I've seen this in Pinecraft Park off of Bay Vista, where it is just like fields of it in that park. It reproduces both through the spores, it reproduces vegetatively by the rhizomes, and also can reproduce from the tubers. So lots of different adaptability in terms of reproduction. Here's a picture of the tubers. Here's a picture of where it's formed this dense stand. You know, we've got some trees in here, but we don't have very many other understory plants. So decreased biodiversity. All right, let's talk about a couple vines. This is Southern Balsam Pear or Momordica balsamina. It is, it's got a lovely sort of palmately cut leaf. It's got these lovely little yellow flowers that then turn into these yellow fruits that turn orange when they are ripe and sort of split apart and have these bright red seeds in them. It is a high invasion risk throughout the whole state. It is originally from Africa, temperate Asia, and tropical Asia, and Australasia too. It is a vine that will, like the Lygodium, it will cover entire areas and cover over whole plants, shading them out so that they can't photosynthesize and they will eventually die. And it spreads by these seeds. I actually have this in our yard here in the state park that we're trying to control, and it has climbed up over an entire building, and we have to keep cutting it back and trying to control it. Here's an example where it's covered over an entire shrub. It has those deeply lobed leaves, yellow flowers, and several seeds. Here again, you see the fruit has split open with the seeds going. The seedlings in the right photos and upper left came up in a disturbed area after Brazilian pepper was removed. So even when we're trying to remove another invasive plant, that can disturb the soil and lead to other invasive plants coming in, unfortunately. Here it is climbing all over somebody's landscaping as well. Here it is covering an entire fence. Here we have the rosary pea. Wilma, can you talk about this one for a second?
Sure.
Thank you.
Rosary pea is another invasive vine. It can take over an area. It has beautiful pink flowers, unfortunately. Actually, the first time I saw it was actually just a few years ago. I didn't even know what it was before that. And it's the seeds are highly poisonous. Its IFAS assessment is prohibited, and it's also on Phlepsy category 1, native to Africa, Asia, Australasia, and Pacific. The poisonous compound is abrin, and a very small amount can cause a fatality. That's like a single seed can kill a person. And that where it can be a problem is because it looks pretty to children and they can pick it up and eat it. The seeds are very uniform in size and weight, that they're used as standards in weight measurement in some places. Historically, it was used to make jewelry. Birds are affected by the deadly toxin and they readily disperse the seeds. A couple of years ago, I was at a site visit and I kept seeing these I thought they were little BBs. And then when I looked closer, I realized it just cleared an area and there were little tiny red seeds all over the place. So they had to, I told them, if you don't pick those up, you're going to have just as bad a problem in a few weeks as you had before, because they had spread rapidly. It seeds very heavily. This is the vine has compound leaves with numerous leaflets. It's found in at least 27 counties in Florida. It's in undisturbed pinelands, and hammocks are being invaded, so not just disturbed areas. It displaces plant communities by growing over trees and shrubs. And you can see in the bottom picture, you can see here I am moving my mouse to show, thank you, Catherine. You can see what the seed pods look like before they open. Once they open, they're brown, and then you see those red seeds inside. It's very difficult to remove because it roots very deeply. And you're you're going to spray it, you need to spray before the seed sets so that you don't have those spreading as well. There's a couple more pictures of the seed pod after it opens with the seeds inside, and that half of the seeds are already out of that. And those are the flowers. You can see how pretty those flowers are, very, very rapidly spreading.
Thank you for taking over for me for a second, Wilma. All right, so here is air potato vine. This is another one that I see in a lot of our county preserves. It's very prolific. It is considered a Florida noxious weed, so it is regulated and prohibited in all areas of our state, which also leads it to be on the Category 1 FLEPC list. It was introduced to Florida in 1905 from Africa, and it is currently found in almost every county in our state. It produces aerial tubers, which we call bulbils, and I'll show you a picture of those in a second. And it also has underground tubers, and it does reproduce from those tubers. It's a great opportunity to have a work day to help clear this. That's one of the best ways to manage it, is to either cut it and pull it down or to collect those air potatoes. And so in one of our county preserves, one of the land managers has actually set up air potato collection stations. It's at Redbug Slough if you want to go there and collect some air potatoes. He has some buckets out, and you can go for a walk and collect the air potatoes in those buckets and then dispose of them appropriately and help the preserve to manage its invasion problem. So our air potato does have a biocontrol called the air potato beetle. And here's a picture of it here. It's a little tiny red beetle that was studied before it was released, and we do not see the air potato beetle affecting any other plants at all, other than this particular air potato vine. And so it does a really good job of eating the leaves. So here you see the larva. The picture on the earlier slide was the adult. And so basically the adult lays its eggs on the leaves, the eggs open up, the larvae eat the leaves, and the adults eat the leaves as well and create this skeletonized appearance, which basically it does not usually kill the plant, but it really depletes the plant's ability to photosynthesize. And so we see far less reproduction. So here we see that in different studies, the air potato beetle decreased vine growth by 39% and also reduced potato production by 67%. So that's really going to drop the viability and the reproduction of this plant. And here is a picture of the actual bulbils. And they can get really large. So they can be small, like the size of a quarter, but they can get really large, like larger than my hand even, and be very heavy. Right before COVID happened, I had actually collected a few of these when I was out on a hike, and I just brought them to the office and left them on my desk, getting ready to dispose of them. And then COVID happened, and we all left the office and started working from home. When I went back to the office, it was only about 6 weeks later, and there was a vine growing from all of the potatoes that I had left behind, and a couple of vines I measured were over 12 feet in length just in those few weeks. And this was sitting indoors on my desk. It had no water, it had very little sunshine, and yet it was able to grow a 12-foot long vine. So once again, these plants are very adaptable to a variety of conditions, which helps them to be so invasive. All right, I'm going to talk about a few grasses. We're going to start to wind down. We have about half hour left in our time, and I want to make sure that I end with enough time for questions, but I'm going to cover a few grasses because these are really important as well. Some of these are really impacting our natural areas throughout the state, but definitely here in Sarasota County, like Kogan grass, which is a huge problem not only in some of our county preserves, but definitely in our state parks, Myakka River and Oscar Shear. So this is a prohibited grass on the Category 1 list. It is native to Southeast Asia. It is incredibly aggressive, forming monocultures. It produces through rhizomes as well as seeds, and it is a perennial grass. It can vary in color, which you're going to hear about in a short video in a second. It is non-clumping, so grasses grow in a number of different growing characteristics or forms. And so there is a native grass called Fakahatchee grass that sometimes is confused with this invasive grass. Fakahatchee grass grows in clumps, whereas Kogan grass just grows in fields, basically through rhizomes. And so that is one of the ways you can tell them apart. You're not going to see Kogan grass in clumping. Its leaves can be upwards of 8 feet long. And one of the best ways to differentiate it from some of our other grasses is it has this very prominent white midrib that is off center. The leaf margins are also finely serrate, so they are actually sort of sharp. Here are the seed heads, fluffy and white. Those obviously can be carried by wind. And this plant can live all the way from the water's edge into dry scrub and sandhills, so a variety of habitats. Here's a picture of it forming a very dense monoculture, and this is down in Northport, just in between two people's property, so not even in a wild natural area. All right, so this is a great video that really tells you more about this plant, so I'm going to share this with you.
We're here at a stormwater pond in Sarasota on the campus of New College. And this campus, like virtually every other property in the state of Florida, has a mixture of both native plants and foreign plants from other countries. Most of these other plants are not a big problem, but some of them are tremendous problems. And one of the worst is this plant in front of me. It's called Kogan grass. It's a plant that has a serrated leaf edge, so things don't want to eat it. It spreads by both wind-borne seeds and underground rhizomes that creep through the soil. And it's been identified as one of the 10 worst weeds on the planet, and it threatens a lot of the United States. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the details that distinguish this really threatening and noxious plant. Kogan grass, Imperatus cylindrica, is from Southeast Asia. It's threatening native habitats and plants throughout the state. Over 20 counties have serious infestations. And even though it's best adapted to full sun conditions, it can grow in moderate shade. Unfortunately, it does really well in fire-based ecosystems where it burns very hot and can actually survive fires that kill mature pine trees. Kogan grass can appear in a number of forms. If it's mown, it can remain relatively short and flower while short. It can grow at least 4 feet tall, and it has a characteristic in the prairies hereabouts of growing just a few inches taller than the surrounding vegetation. So you need to be alert and look for anything from ankle height to over 4 feet in height. Kogan grass is a perennial grass. It has extensive rhizomes. The majority of the biomass of the plant is underground. So when you damage the top part, there's plenty of energy reserves for it to bounce back. When you get close to the plant, you can notice some additional details that will help you identify it. And there are 3 things I want to call your attention to. First, it has a sawgrass-like leaf margin. When you run your fingers down the margins of the leaves, it's very sharp and saw-like. Secondly, the midvein, what we call the midvein on a grass leaf, is distinctive in Kogan grass because it's not in the dead center. It's offset to one side. So when you have a grass with a serrated edge and a midvein to one side, you should immediately be suspicious that it's Kogan grass. To help nail down that determination, reach down to the soil level where the leaves are coming up out of the ground, and that will have a circular or cylindrical feel to it. Many grasses are kind of flat when they're coming out of the ground, and those 3 characteristics will help you identify it when you're close to the plant. One distinguishing feature that identifies most patches of Kogan grass is that whereas the grass has almost a fluorescent green or yellow tint to it, the tips of the leaves, the ends of the leaves themselves, frequently have a weathered or brownish look to them. And if you see a clump of grass that has a kind of glowy yellow character to it and the tips of the leaves are a weathered brown, you should suspect Kogan grass. The bloom, or the seed head, is also very distinctive. It's a puffy, soaky white panicle. And once you learn to recognize this, you'll be able to spot it even at 70 miles an hour on the interstate. It can be dispersed in a number of ways. The seeds are dispersed by wind, and it also, as I said, spreads by rhizomes. Mowing equipment and other heavy machinery can spread the seeds, and it also gets transported in hay, mulch, pine straw, fill dirt, and lime rock. It typically flowers in the late winter to early spring, but it can flower and seed year-round if it's disturbed. So now that you know a little bit about this plant and know how to recognize it, please don't let what happened to us here happen to you. When you start to see an infestation of Kogan grass, get on it right away. If not, it'll spread and you'll have a major problem on your hands.
Yeah, Kogan grass is a tough one, certainly once it begins to spread, but definitely difficult to also treat and manage, and will require often multiple applications of, unfortunately, chemicals. There really isn't another good way to manage Kogan grass. So it's one that you definitely want to keep an eye out for. Torpedo grass is another really common one that we see in lots of places. It is not prohibited currently, although I think Wilma and I might think that it should be. It is definitely considered invasive no uses by IFAS assessment though. It is native to Africa, Asia, and Europe. And it was introduced into our state in 1920 for forage. So they actually thought that it would make good food for some of our agricultural animals, and yet it really doesn't. It is not as nutrient rich as we thought it would be. By 1992, it had taken over 70% of Florida's public waters. So I've seen this in people's yards and then creeping down into some of the creeks and streams, and definitely into our stormwater ponds and our wetlands as well. It has sharply pointed torpedo-like growing tips, which is how it got its name. And another grass that is extremely hard to control, and often you need to have multiple applications of herbicides to be able to control it. It's got a long rhizome. Take a look at that. Here we see it along the edge of a waterway. So it can be low and creeping, but it can also grow somewhat tall as well. Couple other pictures of it. There is that torpedo-like growing tip right there. And a few more pictures to help identify it. I'm going to cover just a few more grasses really quickly. I find grass identification is really, really difficult. So I find that if we talk about a lot of grasses, they all just start to blur together. And there are so many to talk about that are invasive. So I'll just briefly show you a couple more pictures of some of the other invasive grasses. This is West Indian marsh grass. This one was introduced in 1970s. This is actually a clumping grass. And it has a pithy core to its stem as opposed to a hollow core, which most of our grasses are going to have a hollow core. And so here is its inflorescence, so very dense, unique looking inflorescence, and that can be up to 20 inches long. It also forms dense monocultures in marshes and along shorelines, and displaces our native grasses because it has a broader tolerance to different hydrologies in the soil. So it's just going to be able to outcompete our native grasses, yet it does not provide some of the benefits that our native grasses do. Mechanical control of this one is hard because it's most often going to be found in those wet habitats. And along with para grass, which is one that I'm not talking about today, but this para grass and our West Indian marsh grass have become dominant species in the Myakka River Basin's native mating marsh areas. Here's another one called guinea grass. This is invasive in south and is cautionary in central and north. So yet another one, this one can grow very tall. It can be found along canal banks, roadsides, in old citrus groves and other disturbed areas. And then this one, some people call it natal grass. Some people say natal grass or rose natal or rose natal. This one just has a beautiful inflorescence. It's these rose colored flowers. It looks lovely, but once again, it is a problem, especially here in South Florida and cautionary in Central Florida. This one was also registered as a forage grass in 1892, so brought here to feed animals, but once again was found not to have the nutritional levels really necessary to be good forage. It is now found throughout Florida in the southeast US and grows really well in disturbed areas and unfortunately in our scrub ecosystems. Okay, so we are going to talk about the importance of managing for invasive species. So why do we even care? Why don't we just let these plants just continue to grow, continue to spread? Why are they such a problem? Well, it really is a problem of ecological conservation, restoration, and sustainable practices. Invasive plants just are not a sustainable resource. They often are not providing the habitat, the nutrition, a food source that we would get from our native plants. And also they are not sustainable. Sustainable is about using a resource so that that resource is not depleted or permanently damaged. And because these outcompete our native plants and require so much use of our resources in order to control them, they are not a way for us to continue forward with a sustainable or healthy ecosystem. So what do we want to do? We want to have early detection and rapid response, and we call this EDRR, and this is really how we do prevention. So just like at the very beginning where I showed you that aquatic soda apple that we have just seen this year in Sarasota County for the first time, as soon as that biologist saw that plant here in Sarasota County, he sent pictures and an email to all different agencies and personnel so that we could all be aware and be vigilant and be ready to notice it and prevent it and eradicate it. We also need to change cultural practices and education. So that's part of what we do at IFAS Extension is utilize education to try to change some of these cultural practices. So a lot of these plants have been brought in through the nursery or floral trade because they are pretty and they are beautiful. And so that's part of the cultural change that we need to create is understanding the issues with invasive plants and understanding the importance to continue to focus on native and more Florida-friendly plants. And then we can control these through physical, biological, and chemical methods. We always want to do what we call integrated pest management, where we're using a variety of methods to control these pests. And we prefer to start with physical, like hand pulling or using machinery, or some of these plants can even be controlled through prescribed fires. And then our next step would be to use biological controls like the air potato beetle. And then our last and final efforts are when we start to need to use chemical control and start to use things like herbicides for some of the plants that are harder to control through other methods. So that's pretty much what I just talked through is what's on this slide here, is using those physical methods as well as combining them with biological. And some of our successful biological controls are that air potato beetle that you see in the right-hand corner that we already talked about. The Malaluka psyllid and weevil help to control the Malaluka trees. And there is also a tropical soda apple beetle that has been successful. And then we are currently studying those Brazilian pepper tree thrips to see if those will be a successful method of biocontrol. And chemical is always our last option for plants that are difficult to control, or something like the Brazilian pepper tree, for instance, that maybe you can hand pull when it's small, but once it gets larger, it is very hard to You can't hand pull it, and then you can't just cut it down, because if you cut it down, it will re-sprout from the stump in, 10 to 20 more sprouts. And so that is a situation where you do have to use chemicals, and you want to use them according to the label and very judiciously. So you can do something like a cut stump treatment, where you cut the tree and then you just treat the stump so you are not affecting other plants or the soil around it. And each plant that you do utilize a chemical for is going to have specific chemicals that are going to work best, and specific application rates, as well as maybe even specific times of application. So those are all things that IFAS has researched and can provide information to you in order to help you understand the best use of that situation. So the other way or the other ways you can help, really it's about education and getting involved. So it starts with all of us. This is a huge problem that is across borders. It knows no borders. Not one single agency can manage our invasive issues in our state or throughout our country. So we all have to take a role in this. The SISMAs are regional areas, and SISMA stands for Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. So the SISMAs are active throughout Florida, and they comprise a number of different counties. Our local SISMA is the Suncoast SISMA, and that is for Sarasota, Manatee, Pinellas, and Hillsborough County. And so our local SISMAs provide education, as well as offering work days that you can join, especially now that we're starting to come out of COVID. You will have the opportunity to find out about work days that you can join to help remove some of these invasive plants. So we will provide you with the link to find out where your local SISMA is and how you can get involved if you're interested. You also want to report sightings, and this can be really important when we're talking about invasive animals, but also can be important for invasive plants. So there's a variety of ways you can report sightings depending on what you feel most comfortable with. You can do it online through edmaps.org. Once again, we're going to send you all these links. Edmaps.org has a variety of information and also distribution maps. So for instance, this is the distribution map for Brazilian pepper tree. And we're seeing that not only is it moving into northern Florida, but it's a problem along our Gulf Coast, as well as in Hawaii and also in California. So edmaps.org is a great place to find more information, but also a place where you can report sightings of invasive species. You can report them via phone and also on this I've Got One app that you can download onto your cell phone. This can be really useful on your cell phone, because your cell phone will automatically determine the GPS coordinates of whatever photo you're taking and submitting to report the sighting. And then education, just such an important tool. So hopefully you've learned something new today. And certainly there are many people out there that need to learn more about the invasive species issue. And so you can educate yourself and others. Our EDIS website is a list of all of the peer-reviewed research done by the University of Florida, and they have a specific page on the invasive species topic, so you can look there. This is a handy-dandy sort of laminated fold-out identification guide that you can take with you if you're going on a hike and you want to try to identify if there are any invasive species. And then this book is just, it's an amazing book. This is where I get a lot of the information that I utilize to put together these webinars. And that book is available through the IFAS bookstore if you would like a copy of it.
This is the Florida Friendly Landscape Guide to Plant Selection and Landscape Design. A really, really excellent book, although there's a few plants in there which they do have marked over that have become added to the invasive plant list. But the key page 31, we're sending a link to it, and it gives a whole bunch of plants. It gives all kinds of information about them, what section of the state they grow in, how high, wide they grow, what kind of soil they need, what kind of water they need, what kind of sunlight they need. There's just hundreds of plants listed in there. So really excellent book. It tells you if they're native or non-native, if you're trying to go only native. So good information on that book. If you're local to Sarasota County, other counties in the Southwest Florida Water Management District, you can actually order one either from them or come into our office and get one.
We do want to thank you for joining us. Our information is up there on the screen, and you certainly are welcome to email us if you have any questions or need any help.